So this morning we're going to talk about the fifth group, and I want this. There are lots of reasons that we have to do this, but one of the main reasons that I think it's necessary to do this, not just to get ready for your exam, but I think it's just really important to understand in American history this darker side of what's going on as well, and something that is, I think, very hard for us to reconcile, and that is this issue, this one great failing of the founding, and that is the question of slavery and how slavery arises in what will become the United States. But it's got this really odd history to it. It's not what we often think in the way that it's presented, where we see slavery introduced in 1619, and then it just gets worse and worse and worse. We actually find that there are times in American history where slavery gets a little bit better, and then at other times when it does get a lot worse. And obviously, from any moral or ethical standard, slavery is always wrong. I mean, there's just no question about that. But as we're thinking about the reality of it, that is, how does it actually play out in American history, it's a very complicated story in all kinds of ways. And I want to kind of get into that and try and understand exactly what's happening with this question of slavery. So one of the things we can dismiss immediately, as I mentioned the other day, is this idea that somehow we can just say that the founders were men of their time, and therefore we can dismiss it that obviously when you have people who accept slavery, they just accept slavery, and that is not the case at all. We know that throughout much of the Western tradition, slavery has been strictly verboten by churches, by governments, by common law. So there's been a long history to this issue, and there's been a lot of debate on it. We know that in the Western tradition, slavery for the most part died right around the time that the Roman Empire died, so roughly around 310 to 330. And the best arguments we have at that point of slavery dying come from St. Augustine, who argues against slavery as basically as anathema to an understanding of who we are as human persons. And it's a violation of who we are as human persons. And even the very term slave comes from those people who were then being captured, the Slavs. So it had nothing to do with race. It certainly had nothing to do with black and white by any means. That's only in the modern world that we've started thinking of slavery as something that deals with one people against another people. But really, throughout the Western tradition, we don't have it for the most part. And some people have tried to make the claim that serfdom is related to slavery, but it doesn't fit. Serfdom was a much more complicated thing. There was still some property ownership. It didn't go as far by any means as slavery did. So it's a hard thing to make a comparison. But I think we can say somewhat definitively that slavery is not a part of the Western tradition until about 1444. And we actually know that date, which is odd that we can be that specific. But roughly about 1444, the Portuguese decide that they want to attempt slavery, and so they do so in the Canary Islands. They take actual, what we would consider now, modern institution of slavery. They enslave Africans, and they see if this is profitable or not in terms of working sugar plantations in the Canaries. And from their perspective, it seems to be profitable. And so all the other empires start getting involved at that point. The Dutch get involved, the Spanish get involved, the English get involved, French get involved. So they all start competing with one another over this issue of slavery. Slavery itself, in terms of how we understand it in the modern world, is most deeply related to an economic theory called mercantilism. And I want to briefly describe what that is and why that's important for us, especially as Americans, to understand. So mercantilism was a theory that developed at the same time that we see the development of empire. So we have this rise of empire and a number of questions that are being asked about how do we govern an empire, what does the empire stand for, and so forth. And the theory that those people who were advocating empire had was that there are always two ways to consider an empire as it develops. You always have what's directly at the center of the empire, the capital city, what they would call the metropole or the metropolis. This would be at the very heart of the empire. And from that part, everything would radiate and everything would go through. On the far frontier, you would have what are called the hinterlands or the borderlands. And so the theory of mercantilism was that the metropole or the metropolis sends out all of its labor and its resources out to the hinterlands. It grabs as many resources as possible, whatever those resources are. Could be gold, could be precious minerals, or various kinds of timber, or it could be humans, like slaves. It grabs as much as it can, it brings it back to the capital where it reprocesses it, and then sells those reprocessed goods back to the people on the hinterland. So it's a very closed system. And the British are never very good at it. They try it. The French and the Spanish are much better at this system of empire. But as you can tell, it's a closed system, and it's a complicated system. What mercantilism argues in terms of resources, the theory of mercantilism, and it's just mercantile with an ism at the end, but the theory of mercantilism is that there are always in everything just a set number of resources in the world. And once those resources are used, that's it. They're done. So if you can imagine, just for the sake of an absurd argument, but one that's telling, if we had maybe 1,000 tons of gold total in the world, well, if the Spanish were able to get 600 of those tons, that only leaves 400 for everybody else. And so everything is about this very limited pie and who grabs it. Now, anyone who's studied economics knows that this is a false theory, because of course there are always these substitutions who understand can be understood as taking place of the original resource. So what happens when you discover the light bulb versus burning wax candles? Or what happens when you discover that you can take sand and not just make glass, but make silicone chips out of it, and therefore computing power? So one of the things that mercantilism really lacks as a theory is the ability to innovate. It doesn't understand that we can move from the horse-drawn cart to the automobile. It doesn't keep that in mind. So resources are always limited, and therefore it is an absolute necessity in mercantile theory to grab as much as possible, as quickly as you can, and hoard it. This is what you want to do. So whether it's gold or oil or labor, you want all of this. And it means that in mercantilism, even the human being is seen as a means to an end. And so it's really the only way economically we can make any kind of sense at all of what these people were trying to do with the institution of slavery, trying to create a kind of set labor force in which if the Spanish control 60% of it, everybody else has to divide the remaining 40%. So they're always going back and forth about this. And slavery, unfortunately, this horrible institution, gets caught in the middle of all of this. And it's a problem. It's a major problem. Now, in America, and I want to go forward here just a little bit and get my, why is that not moving? That should be moving. Gotta love technology. Nothing's happening. Let's see if I can do it with this. There we go. All right. So with technology and the development of modern technology, and especially with the development of maritime technology, we're going to start seeing, if you guys remember, and we talked about this age of discovery that happens between about 1400 and 1500, where we have a lot of different powers going out and trying to figure out how can they navigate around the southern part of Africa, how can they get to India, how can they get to Japan. And so we have this incredible innovation in maritime technology. But with that, starting in 1444, as I mentioned, we also have the very first attempt at slavery. And so one of the natural questions that will arise, again, not a good question, but one of the natural questions is, can this institution of slavery, which seems to work on islands off of Africa, could it also work in the New World? Now, none of this is meant to diminish anybody's role in any of this or exaggerate anyone's role, but I want you to get a glimpse of what's happening here in terms of where the Africans are coming from and where they're going to. Over 95% of all Africans who were taken during the slave trade, over 95% of them end up either in the Caribbean or in Latin America. Only about 4 to 5% of Africans end up in what is now the United States of America. And you can see where they come. There are some that go to the northern U.S., but almost all of the slaves that come either go to the Chesapeake region, the hot, extremely humid area around what's now Washington, D.C., or they go into the Deep South. There are very, very few slaves who go up into New England. And part of this is simply because of New England culture, but there's some other things that we have to notice as well. So the bulk of these slaves, except for a few who come from Madagascar and Southeast Africa, the bulk of all the Africans that come from West Africa, and especially, as you can see here, from West Central Africa. This is the real hotbed of slavery. But what had happened in the way that the Europeans adopt the issue of slavery is that they latch onto, so when the Portuguese create this system of slavery in 1444, they're actually tapping into what the Muslims had been doing this entire time. So there had been a very strong slave trade throughout Islamic Africa, and specifically against black Africans. This is what the Europeans tie into in 1444 and become a part of this. But it gets very, very complicated. And this is where I want you guys to remember back several weeks ago when we were looking at all the maps. If you remember, one of the things that we talked about was this idea that environment shapes. It doesn't inalterably shape, but it shapes the way that we view the world. So if you remember, the English are extremely successful in their agriculture and in their colonization when they go specifically to places that have the same kind of climate, the same kind of rainfall, and the same kind of soil as what's back in England. And if they can transfer their agricultural techniques, they can almost always take over an area. So the English would have been very happy to take over China. They were incapable of doing it because the environment didn't make sense to them. They would have been very happy to take over India, but they couldn't do it because the environment doesn't make sense to them. So they can impose imperial control. That's one thing. But they cannot remake the culture in the way that they do in North America, the way they do it in Australia, in New Zealand, and in South Africa. In those places, because the soil is basically identical to what they do in England, they can remake all of those areas in their image. So a place like Pittsburgh does not look like anything other than an English settlement. It doesn't look like, still to this day, an Indian village of wigwams or teepees, right? Because the British are able to transfer their technology into that soil. And it's going to take them a while to do it in various places. So there's a reason, as we've talked about, that the English and the English peoples will not be able to settle the Great Plains. It's going to take Germans and Russians who have been living on the steppes of Russia for hundreds of years to be able to make the Great Plains work. This is why those of English descent jump over the Great Plains. They go from Independence, Missouri, all the way up to the Willamette Valley in Oregon, because they can't make sense of the Rocky Mountains or of the Great Plains. The same thing is absolutely true with the hot and humid areas of America. The English, when they settle in places like Virginia, can do fine during the fall and the spring. But when it comes to the summer, they don't know how to plant, they don't know how to make this thing work, and they don't have the proper labor force to make it work. The humidity is simply too much for English agriculture. And so if they adapt, which they do, they're going to adapt by taking a labor force that comes from an almost exact same kind of environment as what they need in America. And so they go to a place, the one place where they can find what that looks like America, and it's not Europe, it's Africa. Africa has a similar kind of environment to those places around Washington, D.C., and in the Deep South, and then in places like Brazil and the Caribbean. So it's going to use that labor force. Now, this is not in any way to justify it. This is a horrible system, but in order to explain it. Now, here's the other crazy thing about slavery, and especially as we understand the way it developed. And I'm not an economist, so you'll have to forgive me for probably explaining this poorly, but we know that on individual plantations, slavery could be a profit boost to the individual slave owner. So there does seem to have been a fairly high profit made by white Southern slave owners on plantations. But we also know that what may have been economically beneficial for a plantation tended to be horrible for the economy overall. So slavery may have been a boost to individual planters, but it was absolutely terrible to the economy. And we can see that by just watching the way the United States develops, with the North technologically and in terms of the frontier greatly outpacing the South, outpacing them in terms of technology, outpacing them in terms of settlement, outpacing them in terms of births and live births. The South cannot keep up with the North. And that is in large part because the free labor system of the North is incredibly fluid versus the slave labor system of the South, which is by very definition static. And so there is no, it's a socialist economy for all intents and purposes. In fact, we start, and we'll see this when we look at slavery later on, but we'll see one of the writers that you have to read for this class, Fitzhugh, when we get to the 1850s, he actually claims that Southern plantations are the ultimate expression of Marxist theory, that this is where you have proof that Marxism works on these individual plantations. And that's a fairly common argument among Southerners. Don't ever, and we'll get into this later, this is a pet peeve of mine, don't ever buy into the idea that Southerners were in favor of states' rights or individual liberty. They were as far away from the idea of states' rights and individual liberty as any people has ever been. That is completely a con at the end of the Civil War, where Southerners try and rewrite their history. They are not in favor of freedom. They are absolutely in favor of oppressive slavery and tyranny in all kinds of ways. So we'll get into that later. But how can you support a system of slavery and be in favor of freedom? It makes no sense at all. It's completely illogical. And that's what we're seeing here now. So when does slavery begin? And this is where, okay, we'll try this. Hey, it worked. This is where it starts getting really complicated again in American history. So this is the mercantilist system as it works, or as it attempted to work. And one of the terms that we use for mercantilism in America is called the triangular system. And what happens here is you have England being the metropole, in which it goes forth into Africa, steals labor in Africa, transports that labor to the West Indies. In the West Indies, it picks up new products, takes them up to New England, and then, or to Virginia, and then brings them back, what products are produced in New England and in America, to England. So these are the triangular trades. They're actually, if you can tell there are two separate triangular trades that are going on. But this is all part of the English, they're not very good at it, but it's their attempt to have a kind of mercantilist system and to implement mercantilist theory into the American system. So the very first Africans who arrive on North American soil do so in 1619. This is why for the last year the New York Times has been running this special called Project 1619, in which they're trying to define American history as rooted in this one moment in 1619, where these Africans are brought to what will be U.S. soil. And what happens is a Dutch man of war ship had taken on a number of Africans in the Caribbean, but was unable to sell them. And so en route back to the Netherlands, they stop in Virginia before heading back to the Netherlands, and they want to dump their cargo. They don't want to have to take these slaves all across the Atlantic. They're sold to the Virginians, but here's where it gets really sticky. When they're sold to the Virginians, they are not sold as slaves. They are sold as indentured laborers. And there's a distinction, because an indentured laborer or an indentured servant means that they are bound by a limited contract in order to pay back their indenture. Now that's absurd, of course, because these people are taken against their will, but they have to pay for their transportation, and once that transportation is paid for, they're freed. And this goes back to the Old Testament Jubilee on the 7th year or on the 7th day, whatever it may be, but years in terms of indentured labor. On the 7th year, black slaves, if they're slaves at all, and they're really not, are freed. And this is where the whole large, very large population of free blacks comes from in the South. Between 1619 and 1669, all of these people who are brought over as forced indentured servants, not as slaves. So they're freed, or what the technical term was called, they're manumitted after 6 years of labor, sometime in the 7th year. And it's almost always the case that during that manumission, you would actually not just you wouldn't just say that the contract has been fulfilled. You would also pay wages, and you would usually give property to those that you'd been working for. So obviously there are free white indentured servants, and then there are unfree black indentured servants. But all of them are treated the same when they get over here for the first 50 years of slavery. And then something happens that no one is expecting, and to this day we don't know exactly why, though historians have done great work trying to figure this out. In 1669, so 50 years after the arrival of the first Africans in North America, people simply stop freeing their black indentured servants. They free their white indentured servants, but they don't free the black ones. And again, we don't know why. We only know because we can look at court records, we can look at probate records. We only know that starting in 1669, people stopped freeing their indentured servants, at least their black ones, their African ones. And that's the real beginning of slavery in America in 1669. Why does it happen? Again, we just don't know. We only know that it does happen. But if you think back, and we've spent a lot of time talking about the colonial period, imagine this is during the English Civil War and then the English Reformation. There are a lot of things going on where England is very concerned with itself and not concerned with us. So there are lots of distractions. It's one reason we don't have great records from the time. And the colonies are really on their own. But for whatever reason, they keep slavery, or they keep their black indentured servants as slaves. And it will stay that way for the most part up until the 13th Amendment is passed during the Civil War. So this is where the real institution of slavery begins. But it still gets a little more complicated than this. So I don't want you to know all of these dates, but I do want you to have at least a rough timeline in your head to try and understand what happens with Africans in America. So 1619, the first ones show up. They are freed after 6 years of labor, but then in 1669, that stops. And suddenly, if you're of black descent, if you're African descent, we have what's called chattel slavery, meaning that not only do you own the person, but you own their children and their children as well. This is the chattel part. So the same kind of terminology that we would use in property ownership over, say, cattle or swine. So what we find here is that the human person has become a commodity in this time period. And if we jump forward, we have roughly, not quite, just a little bit less than a century. We have a century of this growth of the institution of slavery. But then we have this crazy thing happen, this beautiful crazy thing, starting in 1761 and lasting until 1793. During those 30-odd years, we note that slavery in America decreases by anywhere from 33% to 50%. In other words, Americans are releasing anywhere from 1 out of every 3 of their slaves to 1 out of every 2 of their slaves. Anyone want to take a guess why we would see such radical numbers at this point? But yeah.
Is it the Great Awakening?
That's very good. The Great Awakening is going to play a role in this. It's going to start, especially that evangelicalism of my God, my Bible, absolutely, that's going to play a role, a pretty serious one. And when we jump forward 100 years and we get into English history, there especially the English evangelicals will be driving this. Yeah,
Is it
go
also
ahead.
the war, the revolution?
Yeah,
So they need
explain why.
They need their slaves to help fight the war for independence. So they
Okay.
see them, and they see them as free individuals also fighting for liberty.
Yeah. How can you have a declaration that says all men are created equal and then you keep half of your people in slavery? It's completely illogical, and they recognize that. So from about 1761 until 1793, we have mass manumissions throughout North America. Now, that's really important for a lot of reasons. Number one, it's important to show that slavery doesn't always just get worse. It actually can get better, and it can become lessened in some way. It also tells us the power of ideas, and the fact that if you really do believe in natural rights, well, there's no asterisk to all men are created equal. It doesn't say all men except blacks, or all men except Catholics, or all men except Jews. It says all men. And once you accept that, there has to be a way of making that real. And that's what's happening, where individual slave owners throughout the country are just simply freeing their slaves, mostly for reasons of conscience. They don't believe that they can do this any longer. Now, there's also, there's a practical result as well. It's pretty clear that people who own their own property are much more willing to die for it than people who are forced to fight over someone else's property. And therefore, it's in the best interest of both the British and the Americans to free their slaves so that they fight loyally by their side in defense of each other's cause. So there are a number of manumissions that happen for military reasons, but there's always that idea behind all of this as well, that we can't really believe in natural rights if we have slaves. And then this crazy thing, yet again, that nobody would ever predict happens in 1793. A really brilliant, absolutely brilliant technological genius, an entrepreneur, an innovator, a guy by the name of Eli Whitney, who is a devout Christian, devout evangelical, who is a student at Yale, goes on a mission trip to the South to help the slaves. And when he gets down there in the South, he sees that you have all kinds of black slaves working on a summer day anywhere from 10 to 12 to 14 hours. And this is incredibly back-breaking work where they're bent over and they're picking cotton. And I'm guessing nobody in here has ever picked cotton. So there have been a couple times when I've taught this over the last 20 years, I'll get one or two people. But the fact that very few of you even come from farms, I'm guessing that none of you have picked cotton. So picking cotton is a really labor-intensive process. Cotton grows in what's called a boll. So not a bowl like a soup bowl, but a bowl like the bowl of a pipe. And it has these very thick shells or leaves on the outside of the cotton. And you have to break that open. And then on the inside, you've got this kind of yellowish stuff. You're all used to seeing cotton as white because it's been bleached. But that's not the way it comes out. It's much more yellow than that originally. And within that, within a bowl of cotton, you can have upwards of 1,000 to 2,000 seeds. And so prior to the development of the cotton gin, not only did you have to pick this and break it apart, but you have to get all the seeds out, which is, you can imagine, trying to pick out 1,000 seeds out of a bowl of cotton. This is a very labor-intensive process. And we know that prior to the cotton gin, a really healthy slave could pick and process in one day about 1 pound of cotton. Now, that's still pretty impressive. When you think about how light cotton is, picking a pound a day is pretty amazing, actually. But it's expensive, and it was super expensive for the plantation owners. It was becoming so expensive that when you add it together with the idea that this is really probably not morally correct, and it's really expensive to produce cotton. Egypt and India seem to be able to produce a lesser quality cotton, but much more cheaply than we can here. It starts going out of business. And the plantation owners are giving up. It's too much. Here's Eli Whitney, loves in every way Christianity and wants to help the black person. What the cotton gin does is it has these, and it is brilliant, but it has these rotating teeth. So you stick the bowl inside the rotating teeth, the teeth turn it, and pull the cotton at just the right angle so that probably 900 or so of the seeds fall out right away. So it's not the individual picking. It takes out most of the seeds, and then you're just left with a few that you have to pick. And this may be the largest labor-saving device, one of the most important in history. The average slave, remember, could only pick 1 pound of cotton prior to the cotton gin. After the development of the cotton gin, the average slave could pick 1,000 pounds a day. That's how much it changes. Now, irony of ironies, everything Whitney wanted to do was alleviate the pain of blacks. And what he ended up doing was making cotton production extremely profitable in America. And slavery just skyrockets from that point forward. It becomes one of the fastest growing industries in America. But you have to keep this in mind. We'll never understand the founding period without this. When the Declaration is written, when the Articles of Confederation is written, when the Constitution is written, when the Northwest Ordinance is written, all of those 4 organic laws are written at the moment that slavery seems to be dying a very quick death. So when the founders allow in the Constitution 3 compromises on slavery, they are assuming that slavery is on its way out. And the 3 compromises are not to continue slavery, they are to lessen the blow to the South as the South gets out of this system. That's the whole reason. It's to give them a little bit of breathing room. But then everything changes. And now, a few years later, you have this labor-saving device which changes the whole economy of slavery. Does that make sense for everyone? I want you to see why this changes so dramatically. And poor Whitney, right? Whitney just wanted to do good, right? And obviously, it backfired on him. But that was his whole goal, was to do good. But it changes everything. Now, for the purposes of this class, and for American history, I want you to keep this in mind. Think about technology. Now, if something happens in New York, it could take a good 6 weeks or more for news of that to reach the interior of the United States. Now, it's probably pretty good that all the ports are connected with one another. So if something happens in New York, I'm sure Baltimore and Charleston and Boston can find out within a day or two. But news to travel to the interior of the country is very, very slow. And the South is always technologically backward compared to the North. So one of the things that develops, and this is where there's no evil intent in what the Americans are trying to do, it's just the way it happens. One of the things that happens is that the North is convinced that slavery is on its way out during the founding period. And they move on without a system of slave labor. It's all free labor in the North. But the South becomes increasingly dependent upon slave labor. And so you have these 2 almost radically different countries developing between the North and the South. Remember, they're religiously already at odds with one another. The old Puritan culture versus the old Anglican culture. But now you're introducing radically different labor and economic systems as well. The North will develop purely in competition. The South will develop in slavery. And it means that the South will become very used to an institution that it assumes the North understands, and the North will become very used to its institution and will assume that the South understands. And they're not talking to each other, and we're going to go almost 30 years before people realize what's happening. So that sounds bizarre to us. How could you have 2 different countries functioning on 2 different levels where they don't understand it? But they don't. It won't be until 1819, when Missouri wants to come in as a slave state, that suddenly everyone is shocked. The South is horrified that the North doesn't know that they've been a slave power all this time. And the North is horrified that the Southerners haven't gotten rid of slavery. That they're going to just go right past each other. And that is really important to understand for this. Yeah, Camden.
If they didn't put anything in like natural documents because they thought slavery was decreasing, if they thought slavery was decreasing, why didn't they just put something in? As, like, wouldn't it be easy if slavery was decreasing to just make it like, okay, this is lessening and we realize it's an evil, so we're just going to stop it right now, instead of just like, this is decreasing, so we're just going to let it naturally decrease and run its course.
Right. This is a great question, and this is where, and I'll try to mix what I said the other day with today. Right? We can't just excuse these guys as being guys of their time. Right? So I'm in total agreement with the intent of your question, Camden. There's a reason why they let it slide. That doesn't mean it was right. So I want to give the explanation in the context, but not the moral justification for it at all. And I'll read to you in just a little bit, but I want to read to you from the debates of the Constitution, where they're going to go back and forth on this very issue. And they'll make a compromise. Right? They are going to compromise on this. And I think it's a terrible compromise. But they're still going to compromise. And it changes, regardless of our own view, they make the wrong decision. And we'll see the consequences of that in American history. If they had done what you just said, the whole history of the country would be very different, right? In all kinds of ways. It would be radically different. But I only want to give you the context that what the times are, not the excuse that the times made them who they are. Because they're also making choices that are both going with and against their own time as well. Hopefully I'll answer this in a little bit, because I don't think I'm answering it yet, but hopefully I will in just a moment. Okay, so the last two things I want to state today for our class. I want us to look at the evils of this thing, exactly following up what Camden just asked. And incredible quote. Now, this is deeply disturbing. And I want you guys to understand this. This is a very dark part of our history. I'm not sure it's the darkest part of our history. That may go with a few American Indian massacres, but regardless, this is horrible, and there's no excuse for it. So here's one medical doctor who was looking at what was going on the slave ships. And you do need to know this term. The transfer of black slaves to the Americas is called the passage. Now, we have another passage that has nothing to do with this. There's also, when trade goes across the Pacific to Asia, it's also called the passage. But those are two radically different passages. So this passage is the passage of Africans to the Americas. So I know you can all read this, but some wet and blowing weather having occasioned the portholes to be shut. These are on the slave ships. And the grating to be covered, fluxes and fevers. Flux would be like a flu, but there wasn't actually an influenza bug at the time, so it's a kind of primitive form of it. Fluxes and fevers among the Negroes ensued. While they were in this situation, I frequently went down among them till at length their rooms became so extremely hot as to be bearable only for a short time. The floor of their rooms was so covered with blood and mucus, which had proceeded from them in the consequence of the flux, that it resembled a slaughterhouse. So anybody know how long does it take if I moved from, say, West Africa up to Virginia? How long of a voyage would that be? Anyone want to take a guess?
6 months.
How long?
6 months.
Oh, that's a good guess. It's a lot shorter than that. By land, it would have been that, but by sea, yeah.
8 weeks?
Yeah, about 8 weeks. So anywhere between 6 and 9 weeks, depending on the weather and depending on how things are going with the currents. So let's imagine, even if it's 6 weeks, let's give it the best possible. Well, what do these slave ships look like? So we read this, it sounds like, okay, you know, we've got the Hampton Inn suites down below, and they're walking around, and, you know, they can't get out, it's kind of gross, and they're walking around in their own mucus. But, yeah, it's tolerable, maybe. Well, this is what they look like. This is a typical slave ship, and you're only seeing one level. So notice how they are, because see what this is? They strap you down, you're on the ground, and you're tied at both ends. And then they put you packed totally packed to the next person. And what, as you can tell, right? Think about how many people are in that ship. They cannot move. They are chained. And not only can they not move, but this is about 6 levels deep. So we're only looking at one layer of humans. What happens? You have to go to the bathroom. You just go on the person below you. You vomit. You vomit on the person below you. And this is how they move slaves to America. This is outrageous. It doesn't get any more inhumane than this. This is as bad as anything the Nazis or the communists did. Absolutely. This is horrific. And the point is, they're cattle. This is how they're being treated. They're being transported in this fashion. So think about this. And you can see here that they've divided at least by sexes. But think about this. Who's going to make that journey? Who's going to be able to make that? And who's being captured here? Just think about the demographics. What part of a population could survive a 6-week journey, maybe, with these kind of conditions? It's purely Darwinian. They feed people by dropping buckets of food down and allowing, if it hits the mouth, it hits the mouth. If not, it goes on. This is incredible. So who's going to survive?
It's just like survival of the fittest.
Yeah,
So probably
which
like the younger men.
Yeah, almost exclusively younger men. Right? So who's going to make it? Well, men about your age. And some women, but mostly men. And what does that mean for the kind of culture that's going to develop among slaves in America? It's going to be very, very hot-tempered. Young men always are, doesn't matter black, white. Young men are always hot-blooded, always tempered. And not just that, they have none of their elders to restrain them. And they don't even have family. But here's an even harder thing to understand. Every one of us in this room can trace, and now everybody can, thanks to 23andMe and all the genetic stuff, but that's relatively new. Every one of us in this room can trace our ancestry. We can follow it. I can go all the way back to something like 1760 and show all my grandfathers and grandmothers and greats. If you're a young guy ripped out of Africa and you're brought to America, well, this person right here might have one tradition. The person next to him could be from a rival tribe. They may have just been fighting each other and have a totally different system of gods, a different language, everything. And so could that guy, and so could that guy, and so could that guy. And what you find is, as we talk about it, and think about how we grouped it, you've got the Puritans. They come as congregations. You've got the Scotch-Irish. They come as clans. You've got the Virginians. They come as noble families and their servants. They all come knowing who they are, knowing what their ancestry is. The Africans are the only people who immigrate to America as individuals. And they lose everything they had, everything. They have to figure out a whole new language. They have to figure out new religious rituals. They have to figure out everything in their culture. And there's a reason black culture is discontent. There's a reason that we find within it this kind of instability in marriage, kind of instability we see in other things. And not that we can't place certain blames on anybody, regardless of race, but there is no doubt of all those people who came to America, this is the worst aspect of all of it. And I would stress here, as bad as the physical conditions of these ships are, equally bad is the cultural mutilation of these people. Does that make sense? I mean, this is incredible when we think about the horrors of this. So Camden, your question, can we defend this? No, in no way, shape, or form. How did the British defeat, when they ultimately decided through the evangelicals, and they ultimately decided to use the Navy against slavery and against slave institutions? Anyone know on the high seas, pre-tech, no radar, no sonar, How do they know which ships are slave ships? You got British warships out. They've got to find, I mean, how do you know? These guys are all down below. You don't use your spyglass and say, oh, look, there are colored people walking around on the deck, right? You can't, these guys are all down below anyway. Yeah, Isaac.
People tell them the smell, right?
Not just the smell.
The sound.
And some of the bodies being thrown overboard. What would follow that? Sharks. You would watch the schools of sharks. Schools of sharks change. We know that schools of sharks change their entire migratory pattern during the 400 years of slavery because that became their new food source. There's just no excuse for this. It is just horrific in every way. So this is the kind of system that we see being introduced here. Okay, so back to Camden's question. What then happens? How do we deal with that? Well, in the American founding, people know, they very well know, that this is a terrible thing. They understand that. And they debate this. This starts on August 8th of 1787. They start debating whether or not to allow slavery into the United States. And it is definitely the fiercest of the debates that we see during the convention, and understandably so. We understand why it's so bad, but there are a number of people, and I want you guys just to write his name down right now. His name's Rufus King. You got to love the first name. We don't use great names like this anymore. We need to start naming our children Rufus again. But this is Rufus King, and he is the delegate for the convention from New York. So you guys will know later why he's important. He's not important yet, but he will be. So he says, August 8th, he says, the admission of slaves is the most grating circumstance to my mind, and it would be to the greater part of the people of America. The slave trade is iniquitous, and never, ever will any society enjoy prosperity in a slave society. It is not possible. There cannot be prosperity, there cannot be happiness. And the argument goes a little bit further, and that is, do we not know that God himself forbids such treatment as this? But the other side, specifically those from South Carolina and those from Georgia, make the argument, they play hardball. And they say, if you get rid of this institution, we're out. We're not going to be a part of this new Constitution. We're not going to be a part of America. And Congress, the convention debates. It's a very close debate, but they allow for slavery to continue. And the compromise is they will not mention the word slavery ever in the Constitution because they don't want to taint the document with this evil thing. But they will have these three compromises. And the three compromises will allow for the slow extinction of slavery, the gradual extinction of slavery. Now, it may take 100 years or 200 years, but they plan on it. And this, can you guys see, I hate to get too personal here, but can you see my books falling apart? This is my Debates, Volume 2. The first time I read this, I threw the book against the wall. I was in a hotel in Philadelphia, and I threw the book against the wall. I was so mad. And I don't really have that much of a temper, but I was just so upset by this. And Camden, this is to your question. Here we have Rutledge of South Carolina, and he says, I now see that the question of slavery is done. Religion and humanity should have nothing to do with governmental policies. Interest alone is the governing principle of this nation. All right, see you guys in a few days. Thanks. Crazy.
Should